This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica and I am your host. And today I'm joined by Adam Marycz, who is an early childhood teacher, setting manager, writer and facilitator of critical discussion. So today we will be discussing the very important and timely topic of Ofsted's voice must be heard whether we like them or not. So that's the title of Adam's article that he wrote for the Voice of Early Childhood. So Adam, thank you so much for joining.
No problem. Nice to be here.
Yeah, it's really great to finally have you on the podcast. And especially, like I said, on such a timely and important topic. So we've got lots to discuss, including some recent publications from Ofsted themselves, and of course, voices from the sector and our own views as well. So I'll let you kick it off then by, I guess, giving a bit of a introduction and a bit of a timeline of events probably from around this time last year.
So I think it's been quite a sort of heightened discussion for a while in terms of Ofsted's role and the impact that it has on educators. Obviously, like you say, it was around this time last year, unfortunately, where it really got highlighted and thrown into the consciousness of the mainstream media with the tragic death of their head teacher, Ruth Perry, who took her own life after a Ofsted inspection was carried out in her school at the end of the previous year. That sort of really shone a light on how Ofsted inspections are carried out and their impact on educators and their impact on staff, as well as on the children and families, but focusing more on what it's like to be in an inspection, what it's like to be part of it, and the role that the inspectors play and that the inspectorate plays a whole on how they are sort of assessing the quality of education, and as well as checking whether or not settings are following the regulations and the framework, but also the wider side of it as well, and the fact that there is a lot of pressure placed upon that day and what it's like in that day, like a day in the life of the child, as they say, when there's so much more to it than that. Which obviously I think we'll probably go on to explore anyway. But since then, the conversation has been a lot about how Ofsted needs to change and what they need to do to be different, and how they can support the well-being of the teams that they are inspected, as well as the well-being of the children that are there as well. And a lot of that focus has led to some interesting conversations amongst educators, which we'll go into a little bit later, which is what sort of sparked my interest in this particular topic and sort of made me really think about it's something that we need to have a conversation about sort of the divisive nature of the conversations online primarily, but also that have been shared in different spaces as well, and how they might impact people's opinions, but also how that impacts the future of early childhood as well, and the role that Ofsted will play and will continue to play.
Yeah, so it's a very loaded topic, especially now. So perhaps let's go kind of back to again this time last year of the changes that Ofsted decided to make, and that really goes around the topic of pausing inspections, but for schools rather than everyone, so excluding childminders and early year settings. So that's the first issue there, really, in terms of early years and Ofsted's I guess approach to the early years sector.
Yeah, so it was December time last year when the coroner's report into the death of Ruth Perry came out, and the coroner ruled that the Ofsted inspection did contribute to her mental health quite significantly, and that ultimately resulted in her suicide. And then as a result of that, the then chief inspector decided to pause inspections, but as you've alluded to, only for schools, whilst they were trying to complete training for inspectors to help identify anxiety or other mental health challenges that people may be experiencing during inspections. And obviously then if inspectors identify such issues, then they would then be able to pause an inspection during it. But like you've alluded to, that only applied to schools, and that I didn't help the conversation. I don't think that really sort of helped the people's opinions about how Ofsted do treat early years and how they foresee early years, and whether or not they're treated with the same level of respect. Like ultimately, the stress and strain on settings and on practitioners and educators and teachers is the same, irrespective of whether or not and childminders as well. It's the same as irrespective of whether they are in a school or not in a school. I don't think that pressure is really different. I certainly don't have, during my inspections, I don't feel like I feel any less pressure than, you know, the head teacher in the adjoining school does when they're inspected. I don't think that that's the case. And I think that the idea of treating early years as part of the education system involves treating them equally in everything that you do. And whilst there's been a drive to ensure that they're treated differently in the sense of, you know, going back a few years, earlier settings used to all have no notice inspections. Then that was changed to align with schools, so that now you get that half a day's notice. Whereas, you know, back at the time when earlier settings got no notice, I think schools were getting at times weeks' notice at various points. So obviously they've looked to close that gap in that way, but then there's still quite a significant difference in the way that they are treated between the two, and that does unfortunately fuel that sort of divisive nature of the conversations that you'll see regarding Ofsted and the DfE that you will see that permeate social media, and that everyone is probably part of that sees the conversations.
And that really kind of adds to the wider debates around early years not being seen as important in terms of, you know, that lack of professionalism, that lack of training for this sector, not the Ofsted inspectors, the lack of training, the lack of funding, all throughout the pandemic as well. Early years being kind of feeling like we've been forgotten about. Things like that. And then I know that in terms of the terminology as well, so early years versus early childhood, which we'll go on to talk about in a minute, but also mainly like seeing early years as childcare rather than education. That's the main issue really, isn't it? I know that we wanted to discuss that a little bit, because that doesn't really add, that doesn't help how early years is seen, how the sector's seen.
No, and again, you know, it doesn't just come from Ofsted. You know, it's but highlight. It also, you know, it comes from the DfE as well. Like it's something that is pushed down by them as well. You'll see all the time. And you know, at the moment, the conversation is about 15 hours funded, and it's always 15 hours funded childcare. It's never 15 hours funded education. Like it's always the emphasis on it being childcare, and that being the sort of point of the funding, that the government are providing that free childcare rather than anything else. And like you say, the terminology that we use, you know, we talk about it in every other aspect of education. Words matter, and the terminology that you use matter, and the way that is perceived and matters. And like Jan de Beel often talks about, I've seen him, you know, he's spoken about it at the Nursery World Show, he spoke about it at the Voice of Early Childhood Conference last year, and about how the use of the word childcare, or the phrase childcare, it will ultimately, he believes, mean that it will never be taken seriously as a sector. And I do sort of agree, and I do see where he's coming from, and I do think that whilst, yes, the care aspect of early years is significant and is important, you know, which, like you said, we'll explore it a little bit, it isn't all it is. And I think if you are just saying childcare and you are just hammering home that point, then it does belittle and it does diminish, you know, the skills of the workforce, the importance of early years and early childhood on children's development and on children's futures. And Ofsted, on the one hand, will push that idea of early years is really important, but then also Ofsted and the DfE will then push the idea of it just purely being childcare by just honing in on that word. And then that, like you said, it doesn't help. It just adds to the the angst and adds to the frustration seen in the setting of that. Well, we're not taken seriously. There's no funding, there's no support for training. There's no real recognition of the highly skilled workforce and that there is in early years, and also the important, the vital role that they play prior to children, starting what is foreseen as education as to when they start, a formal school in reception in year one.
And obviously care roles are very important, and we talk about healthcare, etc., and all the caring professions are so important anyway. But what we're talking about here is the fact that there is that separation, a very clear separation between education and all the education settings, so schools really, and early years, which is childcare. So the main thing is that it's not seen as education. And like you said, of course, there is that care element, and that's the argument that many people have in the sector, who say, it is so important to not lose the care element, even when we change perhaps the language that we use. But it is possible to kind of use that language that is used a little bit more internationally and in academia, in terms of not just saying early years or early childhood, which is early childhood is recognised more internationally, but saying early childhood education and care. So really, obviously a bit of a mouthful there, but really putting the care and education element together. And I think it's just really important to reflect on things like this and consider what are the messages we as a sector are giving out. And another point is actually, again, Jan de Biel mentions this in terms of, do we say sector or profession? So, really kind of professionalizing the workforce by saying profession, rather than just, a workforce, a sector, just kind of bodies working. Actually, it's about educated professionals. So the language that we as educators in our workforce, in our profession, use is really important to reflect on, because that is the language that we're encouraging others to use about us, and it really affects how people see us. So I think there's that responsibility of not really wanting to say us and them kind of thing, but us as the profession, us as educators, us as consultants, specialist speakers in early education, really thinking about having that responsibility of the language that we choose to use. It's not just us saying it's all on the government and their choices of terminology and language. I think it's so important to have both, and I know this is kind of the whole point of the conversation, especially the things that we'll go on to talk about in a minute, that it's everyone's responsibility. We can't just say it's so and so's fault, it's the government's fault for the way that they approach us. It's also our responsibility to make sure that we are professional, and the language that we choose to use does actually come from a place of reflection, and everything that we choose to say has some kind of purpose and meaning behind it.
Yeah, and I think like you say about how we describe ourselves, it's when you're talking about with parents, we talk about the idea of having an early years teacher in the setting, and that element of how parents foresee and describe that who they are. Parents, when they're talking to you, always that your teacher, and how loaded those words are, and how they're being used and perceived, and how, like you say, how we describe ourselves. Obviously, the level 3 now is early as educator, so there's the emphasis there on you. Like, our job role is as an educator, but equally, the early childhood education and care is a great solution. Like, it is an internationally recognised solution as well, and it's something that we need to probably use more, on a outside of the academia circles, and we need to use more with the students and the educators of tomorrow. The students who are undertaking the level 3s and level 2s. They need to understand that they need to have those reflections and those conversations about how we do that, how we perceive ourselves. It all also leads into that conversation, which is a far bigger one, about the idea of play and the importance of play in early years, and whether or not play is educational, whether play is learning, and all of those conversations that you're having around the very nuances of the words. But they do matter so much, because even in terms of if you're referred to as a teacher, it will make you feel internally, like your educational role is probably more important than if you're not. In the same way that it is in schools, in the same way that teachers and, you know, classroom assistants, teaching assistants, whatever the terminology is there, are different. And how that sort of makes people feel about themselves and about their role and about the importance and the value that they place on that. And the importance of education in these early years is something that is often lost, and is something that, like I say, it's everyone's responsibility. But that's the whole point, I think, that, you know, in recent times we've seen this drive to sort of silence certain aspects of early years, of early childhood, from all sorts of different sides and different stakeholders, trying to silence the other because they don't agree, or because they feel they're divisive, or because they feel they're not, you know, they're not striving for the best outcomes for children and families. And it's that divisive nature of that, and all of that, that is just continuing to fuel this divide that we're seeing. And it isn't at the moment, it's not getting any less, it's just becoming more and more toxic. Obviously, the language on social media is fairly divisive anyway. You know, societally, things at times are looking fairly divisive too. So it's trying to find ways that we can, if we're all striving to achieve that common goal, which ultimately we are, because we're all in this role to help provide children and families with the best possible, you know, outcomes for children to reach their full potential, and to have the best opportunities in life to succeed, then we all have to work together to do this, and we're not isolate each other because we don't, you know, yeah.
Well, this really leads us on to that discussion of what happened just over a year ago now, when Ofsted were uninviting or banning early childhood speakers and leading voices from speaking at events. And obviously this has fueled even more divide, like you said, on social media, and in our kind of circle and bubble of early childhood education. So let's discuss that. This is something that you do mention in the article, and I think it's really important to really unpick it and discuss how none of this has been helpful, obviously, but actually our response as the early childhood profession is also not very helpful either. And we do have that responsibility to fix things, I guess, in a way, you know, as bad as it seems, of like, it's not our fault that this is happening to us, we still have a responsibility to do the right thing here.
Yeah, so we saw obviously last year on social media a lot of educational experts, a lot of people who are involved in education, sort of sharing information that they were finding out about both Ofsted and the DfE, having looking at what they've been posting on social media and how that was potentially used by officials within those departments to try and either, you know, cancel conferences or prevent certain people from speaking. And then there were a few investigations by various newspapers. I think the Observer and the Guardian were two of them that looked into this deeper, and they found something that I find interesting, is that the stronger practice hubs for nursery settings. They found guidelines related to the stronger practice hubs that were designed to prevent anyone who'd criticised the government in the previous 3 to 5 years from speaking at those events or participating in those events. And like you say, that has fueled the divide, which you can, you know, completely, you can see why it's helped to create that division, because that idea of silencing, you know, in the article I mentioned the idea of sort of silencing voices of your critics, irrespective of what of who your critics are, is not it's not the democratic freedom of speech way that we are encouraged to support our children to learn about when we're teaching about fundamental British values, for example. We're encouraged to speak to the children about democracy and, you know, individual liberty and the idea that they all have freedom of speech. But then you're seeing voices within the sector being silenced and having their opinions, you know, hidden essentially from DfE or Ofsted endorsed events because they are slightly critical of those policies. And whilst that, you know, I share that frustration and find that that's just not okay. That behaviour is not, it isn't helpful. It's not democratic. It's not what you expect or want to see. Equally, the reaction by the sector at times to decide that they're not going to invite Ofsted or the DfE to certain events. They don't want to speak at events where they're speaking. They don't want to engage with the relevant bodies. It isn't helping either. That's just fueling that. And part of me thinks, is that just playing into their hands? Is that just what they want? Because there's no opportunity for those discussions. There's no opportunity for those critical reflections. There's no opportunity for the contrasting voices to be heard at the same time. So all that people are getting when they go to conferences or events is they're just getting one angle, they're just getting one viewpoint. They're not being allowed to have those shared viewpoints, and obviously there's no opportunity for those shared viewpoints to have a discussion together either.
Yeah, and I know that a lot of people have said before that even when Ofsted are at events and they are speaking, a lot of the time the early years profession, the practitioners, the educators, the speakers themselves feel that Ofsted are not really there in the room to listen. They are there to just present their view. So a big thing that we're trying to do at the Voice of Early Childhood, and I know me and you have discussed this a lot, is the fact that Ofsted need to be present at events, conferences as delegates and not just as speakers. So they do listen to the voices of practitioners and other speakers and consultants, and they are there as part of the early years community rather than being a speaker at the front and be seen as the experts and actually not really listening to what anyone else has to say and not kind of staying to listen to the other speakers. That there are some comments that have been made in the past. And of course, there is, the previous like Ofsted Big Conversations, and then they've got their YouTube channel where they do talk about myth busting, and there's lots of articles and things like that. But that is, again, just coming from them. And yes, they do obviously get that from somewhere, the myth busting aspects, they obviously hear that from the sector and then they try and bust those myths. But it's more than that needs to be done. People need to see Ofsted being part of the community, like I say, in terms of, sitting down amongst the delegates and hearing everyone's voices and not necessarily always having something to say, but actually, really, really listening to the experiences, the views of the sector. And yeah, of course, we do need to still open up that dialogue and debate, both from Ofsted have done that in terms of their myth busting, but we need to really be still coming to these events where Ofsted are speaking, inviting Ofsted in and really encouraging those conversations. And as influential figures in the early childhood space, so the speakers, the consultants, the trainers, they need to be modeling that dialogue and that shared reflection with Ofsted. So if there's something that we disagree with, we disagree on, that Ofsted propose or say, then we need to actively challenge that. Otherwise, things are not going to get changed. Things will not change, and we will be kind of sitting on the sidelines complaining about Ofsted. But what have we done to change things, especially more publicly, and not, and I guess social media is the public domain to do that, but that doesn't really play into that professionalism that we so often kind of don't see in the early years sector anyway. It's not about posting it on social media and posting our frustrations there. It's about having that active, reflective, professional dialogue. And I think that needs to be modelled by the people who have been unfortunately silenced. And obviously it's really easy for us to sit here and say that because we are not these people that have been silenced. But it also is the responsibility of so many educators, speakers, organisations out there to advocate for the sector and to spark these discussions and reflections and to invite Ofsted in and invite the DfE in and all be part of these shared spaces. Otherwise, what I always say is we're always preaching to the converted, aren't we, in terms of we sit in these conferences, events and things, and it's a room full of the same people, the same educators, we're all in the same boat and we all have the same views. So there's no one actually that we're reaching out to and challenging. There's no one challenging us. So it's just so important to really reach out and have different voices heard and listen to different voices as well.
Yeah, I think like that it's a two-way street, isn't it? And it's something that we're all responsible for. Every stakeholder, everyone who's got an interest in early childhood and early years and education and childcare and whatever words you want to throw at it, every person who has got an interest in that has to all pull together, be in the same direction. They all have to be able to sit in the same room, sit around a table, again, however that looks, and have those conversations and be able to have those discussions that are going to be uncomfortable, that are going to be difficult, that are not going to be at times, I might at times get a little bit, heated, but that can be done in a professional way. And that's got to be done because not everyone's views are the same. Everyone is ultimately always going to see things differently. Everyone's seeing things through their own lens. Everyone's got their own life experience. Everyone's got their own professional experience. Everyone's got their own choices and ideas and thoughts that they bring to early childhood. But by just, like you say, by not engaging with certain bodies, organisations, people, however you want it to be, that nothing is going to change and nothing's going to get any better. And also, I think partly it's about that humanising aspect as well. I think the idea of like you say, Ofsted, the DfE, or different organisations all coming to events, coming to settings to speak to practitioners, coming to local authority events, whatever that might be. If they're coming to engage and to discuss and to explore actual views and not just present their latest research or their latest handbook or whatever and then leave, that provides that sort of humanization. Like a lot of time when you speak to educators, there's a fear of inspectors coming in because they don't feel like they can make that personal connection with them. They can have that conversation. My most enjoyable, which is a frightening word to put against an Ofsted inspection, my most enjoyable Ofsted inspections have been with inspectors who you can have a conversation with beyond, point 4.3 in the handbook. You can have that conversation about how they see what you're doing and how they see what the impact of that is, and then you could have that conversation about why you're doing that and what that impact is, and then that reflection can happen then in the moment. Then as you can be like, oh, maybe it's not achieved what I wanted, or they've seen something that you haven't. And that humanization of ultimately we are all people, we are all human, and like, okay, yes, people are coming in with very strict guidelines, but they're human at the end of the day, and at some point they have worked with children because they have decided to do this role. So, and at some point they've worked with people. So those conversations can just like a 5-minute conversation with a senior inspector could break down all preconceptions and misconceptions that educator's got about what Ofsted's role is. And it's not a 5-minute stand at a podium and read a PowerPoint. It's a 5-minute conversation outside of that, afterwards, before, during, whatever, that are just about, oh, well, I've seen this, or I've seen this, or I do this, or whatever. Like, what are your views? Like, what are your thoughts? What do you think? Not what is that, 5-word sentence that you regurgitate, that you say. At every event, Ofsted say, share similar stuff. Like every event you go to, it's all fairly similar because you know what they're going to say, because you know what it's about, and all of these, for everyone to work together, it needs to be much more personal. It needs to be much more human, and it can be professional and human at the same time. Those two things can go together, and they need to be able to. Everybody needs to be able to sit down and be like, right, so this is what we see. This is what we see. How can this work? And if you're deciding that you can't be at an event where they are, well, they're inviting you to this event, or they're inviting this particular organisation to this event because they don't like what they've said. Like that's it. Nothing's going to help. Ultimately, if we're all in this for the children and their families, which we are, well, then we've got to forget that outside noise. We've got to forget that rhetoric that you see on social media, and that divisive nature of that. And the changes, if Ofsted are going to change, and if the DfE are going to change, and if the sector and the sector and early childhood and early years is going to change, it's only going to do that, like you've just said, by us sharing what we want to change. Because if we don't, they can argue they don't know. It's very easy for people to say, well, we don't know what people want to change because no one's told us, or we don't know because they won't invite us to this event, or
and they won't engage
obviously
with us anymore.
Yeah, they won't have that conversation. I mentioned in the article like a scenario that when obviously you're listening to people say that we shouldn't engage with them anymore. Then okay, so the scenario I put is about if Ofsted come to a setting, are you going to tell them they can't come in? Are you going to refuse them access to your setting because you don't agree with a particular policy that they brought out or a particular thing that they're looking at? Of course you're not. Like, of course, no one's going to do that. Someone might sit on social media and decide that they're going to, say that they're not going to speak to them anymore. But no one is going to do that. What if someone's best friend might be an inspector? What they're going to do? Decide they're not going to speak to them anymore, not going to invite them round for tea. Like it doesn't. That divisive nature is not going to help. There's got to be a line drawn somewhere, and I think that we're dangerously close to a line being crossed that is going to be very difficult to row back from, and it's going to be very hard to get back to the point of collaboration and the fact of putting all and as part of the idea behind what we do, that the voice of everyone matters. Everyone's voice is important, and that irrespective of whether or not you agree with them, their opinion matters. And you can't change someone's opinion by not speaking to them. No one's view is going to change if they, like you say, if everyone's just sat in a room of like-minded people, then all what they're going to think is, well, that's the like-minded people there. We're right, brilliant. Let's carry on. And that's never going to be any different. And we're just going to have the same problems that we've had for the past decade. We're going to have them in 10 years, going to have them in 20 years. It's just going to be like Groundhog Day. We'll just go over and over again.
Yeah, and we certainly can't say that, if we're annoyed that our voices are not being heard and being silenced, then silencing other people, in organizations, it just doesn't make any sense. It just can't be happening. And what are we modeling to our children as well, in terms of, what you said about fundamental British values as well. And yeah, like you say, it's we don't have to agree with Ofsted, but we still need to engage with them because they are the regulatory body, and there's absolutely no getting away from that. The only thing we can do is work with them to change things. There's no other way at all, really. So I think in terms of talking about the fact that Ofsted do need to listen to all voices, and they need to attend events, and they need to go to settings and speak to educators, this really moves us on to the recently published article or blog by Ofsted. And this is talking about Sir Martyn Oliver's priorities. So HMI Chief Inspector. So he really discusses all of the things, really a little bit like what we discussed on the episode so far, going back to this time last year and before. And some of the things he mentions are a few, reasons and justifications why the decisions were made around not pausing inspections for early year settings, which we can go into, and then obviously around some priorities and new things being put in place in terms of listening to the voices of the sectoral profession. So would you like to, Adam, tell us a little bit about the blog and what the discussion was really there about in terms of those justifications around not pausing early years inspections, because that's quite an interesting thing there that's mentioned.
Yeah, so this blog I think was literally published yesterday by the new chief inspector, and yeah, that point is something that I found really interesting. That will be totally put on my hands. I'll be completely honest, not something I'd really thought of in the angle that it's been portrayed. So part of the argument for the reasons as to why early years inspections weren't paused in early January when school ones were was because Ofsted is the regulator and the inspectorate for early years, whereas obviously in schools, the DfE is the regulator. So they argue that they continued their regulatory work during January whilst they were training inspectors as a way to support new settings to open and settings to remain open because they are the regulator. And that's something that I hadn't really thought of in quite such a nuanced way. Whilst it is completely accurate, they do decide what settings remain open and what settings close, and in a way that they don't decide whether schools remain open or schools close. It does provide an interesting challenge for Ofsted to navigate if they do get to a point where they do need to pause inspection for any reason, like we saw through the pandemic, because that regulatory work around what the statutory framework is and what the regulations are is really important in terms of keeping our children safe, fundamentally, more than anything else, more than the inspections themselves. Keeping the children safe is the primary sort of responsibility of Ofsted in early years and in childminders. So that is, I now understand why they decided to keep their inspections. I do still find it frustrating that inspectors for schools were trained by the looks of it potentially first on looking for signs, recognising visible signs of anxiety, but obviously it's trying to find that balance between, like everything, a lot of things are balanced. It's trying to find that balance between ensuring that you are keeping children safe by continuing the regulatory, but also training the inspectors to identify visible signs of anxiety. And at the moment, there doesn't seem to be a lot of information out there about how that looks and what that might be, because I think they do highlight that they're hoping to train all the inspectors by the end of March on this, so that all inspectors will be looking out for signs of anxiety and stress when they are inspected settings. But obviously that matters, and that's really important, and it's a important and significant change that they're looking to bring in. I think part of it also we need to take that step back and actually consider why we feel so stressed and anxious when we're being inspected, and what is causing that in the first place. Of course, yes, you can look to identify it and solve it when you do it, but surely the most important thing is preventing it. That it shouldn't be. We don't need to just be looking at being reactive to a situation. We need to look at how we can prevent that situation from occurring in the first place. And I think, for me, a big way that you can do that is by being accessible, by engaging, by being real, and by breaking, not just posting a Mythbuster video on YouTube, but like I say, having those conversations, coming on to podcasts, and not just podcasts that are friendly to you, not just engaging with people who are friendly to you, which is the easiest thing for everybody to do, but engaging, have that in challenge. The idea of, you mentioned at the start, the idea of critical reflection, and the whole point of like something that I'm fundamentally believing is that power of critical reflection and critical discussion. And you need to be uncomfortable, because if you're always comfortable in the conversations you have, then you're not changing. You're not progressing, you're not growing, and nothing is going to progress and grow, and nothing is going to change if we're just sat here, as we said before, having the lovely, comfortable, enjoyable, flowery conversations with the people who are our friends and who we like and who we all share the same opinion of. One of the many reasons that early years is so brilliant is because it's full of so many different opinions, and because there is no necessarily right way and there is no necessarily wrong way. There is a way that has dozens of different ways that have dozens of different impacts, and one way will work for one group of children and one set of families, and one way simply won't. And that is one of the brilliant things I enjoy about early years, the fact that you can have those conversations, so you can really change, and you can see the difference between the way that it operates in different spaces. And those discussions, they need to be a part of. Everyone needs to be a part of that. They need to come and sit down. And I think, going back to a little bit, just want to go back to a second what you said before about was modelling. So obviously we have to model to the children the idea of free speech, and we should be modelling to each other in terms of how and who we shouldn't engage with it. But I think the most important role of like I say, experts, consultants, speakers, people who've got who are in the public domain within early years and early childhood. They should be modelling to the educators of tomorrow, the students, the college students, the university students, the people who are following these influential people on social media and seeing them as up on a pedestal of they've achieved great things in their career, so their opinion is really important. Should we really be modelling to the people who will be those people in 20 years' time that this is the way to behave, that we can actually just ignore people because they don't matter, let's ignore them, no one cares what they think?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's always important to go back to that. And I think on your point of the fact that it's not okay to just be in spaces, like we both mentioned this, in spaces where everyone just agrees with us, and like you say, on a podcast where we know that people will be nice to us and have the same views as us, and I guess here we are sat recording a podcast where largely we agree. Although it's important to mention the fact that there are a few things, like in the article that you wrote, that we kind of went through together, and then a few of the podcast kind of conversations we had before recording, we didn't agree on everything. So of course, it's always important to have that dialogue. But here we are, we're still we don't hate each other for disagreeing. But what is important to say is our thoughts around Ofsted coming on to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. So, this is actually the first, I guess, public announcement of, we want to invite Ofsted on our podcast, and we want to invite them to have these discussions, have these reflections, and have it all shared, and also make sure that educators and that the early years sector can hear these conversations. And again, it's modelled, and it's not just we're going to invite Ofsted to have a meeting behind closed doors and that's that. Actually, it is important to have these discussions in open spaces, as well as events like we mentioned earlier. So another thing is that so Ofsted have been invited to the Voice of Early Childhood conference, which is only happening in a few weeks. So that's already kind of happening, that momentum. Hopefully more organizations will invite Ofsted to be delegates. They've not been invited by the Voice of Early Childhood to speak. So hopefully we will see some change here, and kind of watch this space and see what happens, and if we can really engage in that collaborative discussion and reflection that we talk about. It's not just about us sat here saying this needs to get done, we need to make sure that we have this approach. Actually, it's about putting in that action and making sure that we are doing something about it, and we're not just talking about it. This also really then links to the Chief Inspector's priorities around future changes with the way that Ofsted work. So he mentions the fact that he wants input from the sector on decisions that are being made. Some of these ways in which the sector will be involved by Ofsted will be things like the big listen that's been mentioned in this blog. So we don't know what this will look like, how this is going to happen. No one knows yet. It's only been mentioned briefly in that blog. But in terms of ensuring that educators' voices are listened to, if you do want to put your views across to share with Ofsted, then please do send them through to the Voice of Early Childhood via a short form to fill in. So the link is in this episode description and on Adam's article on the website as well. So just so that you feel like you can send it in somewhere if you're not sure about sending your views directly to Ofsted. Often there are barriers kind of put in place to make sure that Ofsted can manage all of the things that has been sent into them, including requests for speaking and probably complaints here and there and all sorts of things. So they do always say fill in a speaker form, fill in this form, and of course that's understandable. So if you feel like you would like to really put your views across, then we will be collating those views from the sector. And again, we don't know how this will look like in terms of sharing them with Ofsted. It might be a bit of a Q&A, it might be on a podcast, it might be a bit of like an open letter, but the views and voices of the sector will be shared. So do use the Voice of Early Childhood as that platform for sharing your voices, which is exactly why it's been set up and exactly why we're sat here having this not only kind of conversation of like, oh, what's your view, what's your opinion, and what are we going to complain about today. It's all about discussing these thoughts that are so different, and not everyone agrees on. Yes, me and Adam are agreeing here, but we're really voicing all of these frustrations that the sector are having, and some of these views, they are, like I said, divisive and polarizing, and we are addressing them, and we are challenging people, and we would like more people to kind of step up as well and challenge others, challenge us, and it's all about that shared dialogue, isn't it? So yeah, I just think it's really important to make sure that we really respond to things like this, like the blog, the big list, and what is that going to look like? How can we get involved, and not just sit back and think, okay, we're just going to hear back from them and wait for them to roll out the big list and whatever that is, and then just go with their plan. Actually, let's start that conversation now. Let's start the ball rolling, I guess.
Yeah, like I say, let's be proactive. Let's not be reactive.
Mhm.
Like I say, let's offer that opportunity. And it would be brilliant to have someone. Let's get Martyn Oliver on the TVOEC podcast, but have someone to come and explain their rationale. I think it's about that understanding, because they've explained in this blog about the idea of the inspector and the regulator, and it's something that I've not seen many people sharing online as being an idea for why they kept inspection. So there was clearly rationale there behind their decision. So come and share that. Let's have those conversations. Right, the sector's saying this. How do you see it? Or you're saying this. This is how we see it. Has this been portrayed to you? What opinions are being garnished when they are making choices? In the same way as us, when we're making choices, what opinions are we getting when we're trying to get opinions from everybody in the sector? I think the idea is of that critical reflection. And those conversations, they can be had because we could invite Ofsted, the DfE, to events, to speak, to discuss, to be a delegate, like to listen, to talk to the educators who are dealing with the problems in the setting all the time, and talk to them about that, and provide their reasoning for things, and not sort of like the reasoning that's provided in the start of a handbook, but actual granular detail. Like we considered option A, option B, but we decided on option C. Well, let's find out what the other options are first. What else was considered? What's not what's the end product? And if we can get people to engage and get people involved, then brilliant, then all the better. And like you say, also challenge us. I'm open to someone coming and come and tell me why you don't believe that if you don't believe we should engage with them, and we should just ignore them and put them in the corner. Come and tell me why you believe that we should do that. Not just because not just because, well, they're doing it to people. I accept that. I accept they might be silencing people, fine, but it doesn't mean we have to. Two wrongs don't make a right. It doesn't mean that we have to react that way too. We can be the drive for change. We can be the reason that changes, and they may feel that there may be reasons why they've done that. They may be able to, they may provide justification as to why they've decided that's the case. We simply don't know, because nobody asks the question, and no one, likewise, no one comes to engage. In. So like you say, they invite them. Let's invite them to things, and we never. He mentions that over the next 5 years, obviously he wants to visit settings, attend events, do podcasts, webinars, articles. Well, come on.
Yeah, well, like we said, if Ofsted are saying they're open to this, then let's meet them at that point. If they're willing to have these conversations, let's now not push back, because this is what we want. So when you mentioned there, it's important to have those more detailed conversations of like, why did you make this decision? What were the options here? I think that's so important, because the sector doesn't want to feel left out in decisions which are made about them and for them. So it shouldn't be the case of like what we hear a lot of the time in research, in terms of like, say, if we're involving children in research or not. It's not about doing research on children or on educators, it's doing research with them and having their voices heard as well. And it's the same here as well. The sector doesn't want to, as many of those voices say, it doesn't want to feel done to. We want to feel like the decisions made about us are decided, put forward with us as well, with the sector, and not just done to them. So it's so important to make sure that we voice that, the fact that we want to listen, we want to hear what your policies are before you put that policy in place for us. And yeah, of course, there's consultations out there, but a lot of the time we are frustrated that we still feel like we're not listened to. Do we just respond to the kind of consultation as it is and don't really make a big fuss about it? I think if we strongly disagree with something, we shouldn't just fill out a form. We should have more of that dialogue, like you say, and question why are these decisions being made? Why is there even a consultation about this if we completely disagree with this potential policy, for instance?
Yeah, like you say, obviously the consultations that go out, as you've alluded to before, when you fill in speaker forms and that for and this isn't just an Ofsted DfE problem. This is a problem with any consultation that's ever given to anyone about anything. No one ever sees the process behind that. You're not seeing what is done with that information. You're not seeing how that information is collated. You're not seeing how that information is discussed, or even what those views really are to an extent. So that transparency, I think, it's a conversation I have fairly regularly with other settings and stuff when you're making decisions on a granular level in terms of, like, say, fee increases. When you're making a fee increase decision, my argument all the time is you need to be transparent. Just tell your families why that is the case. Not, don't be vague. Just tell them. If it needs to be put down, like, this has gone up 10%, this has gone up 8%, this has gone up whatever, do that. That level of transparency will ultimately lead to understanding, and will lead to people be like, okay, I get it. All right. What often causes divisiveness and gets people's backs up is when there is no transparency, and when, like you say, when people feel like they're being done to. And the part of the huge power of Birth to Five was because it's by the sector for the sector. That phrase that you hear all the time regarding Birth to Five, that you obviously don't hear about development matters, as that came from the DfE. So again, here, like, okay, so let's have these conversations. Let's have a conversation about what's in the handbook. Let's discuss why they're looking for that, and what that actually looks like. It's something we've discussed ourselves when we've been talking about, Ofsted and the handbook and inspections and that. There's so many grey areas that are deliberately grey and deliberately vague because everything's open to interpretation. Same with the statutory framework. It's all at times grey and vague. So let's have these conversations, get these people coming to sit in a room full of people where you've got 500 educators at an event, and let's ask the questions of, right, so what does this actually mean? Or how did you get here? Or, okay, they can come to you and be like, okay, so we put this in there. What are you doing with that? What do you think that looks like in practice?
And of course, there can't be solutions from one event, and and there can't be agreement on every point, and this will make things a lot more complicated if more voices are being having an input. So it's not an easy task. It's not something that is straightforward, but it is just about starting off that kind of more collective focus rather than that divisive narrative that we're seeing. So, if the DfE do listen to a wider range of voices, and not just those voices that they feel like that already agree with them or work with them, and then already there's more voices being heard there. There's more variety, there's more experiences, there's more views from the ground, from practice. And I think it's so important to be realistic here as well. As educators, we shouldn't get frustrated with the fact that our personal voice wasn't heard in this particular policy, or this change. Well, actually, like I said, you can't change everything, and you can't listen to every single person's voice, but it's just starting somewhere, isn't it? And it's just being open to voices from the sector, and not just Ofsted themselves or DfE themselves, or the usual voices that they listen to. It's just being that little bit more open, and then seeing what can be put into place, and at least, like you say, sharing their justifications, their reasonings, their options available. Of course, it makes it all a lot harder in terms of, you know, processes and procedures and things like that. But there's no other way in terms of, you know, the way that things are happening now, how divisive the sector is. That is just not an option. Like you say, if we keep moving forward with that, then we'll get to a place where there's no going back in terms of we can't go back and collaborate and work together because a line has been crossed too far, potentially by both sides.
Yeah, like at no point I don't want anyone to come away from this and think that that I am at all in any way justifying the silencing behaviour of that we've seen in the articles in the Observer and the Guardian. Absolutely not. Like, it's not okay, and it needs to stop instantaneously. You know, there is no room for anybody to be silenced and for anyone to have their, you know, platform taken away from them, to have speaker conferences cancelled, to have, you know, that's got to stop. But equally, it's also got to stop from the other side of people saying that they're not going to engage. That has to stop too, because it's just going to get bigger. It's just going to get more. It's just going to get worse. It's just going to be like, oh, well, this person said this about me. This person said this about me. So no, forget it. Like, ultimately, the DfE, Ofsted, they're all run by humans. And if we start openly sort of, you know, assassinating someone's character on social media because we don't like this particular human being who's running it, then what's their motivation? No one's going to decide to engage with someone who personally attacks them. So therefore, it has to stop on both sides, and therefore it has to then be able to be brought back. And organisations, individuals, people could start to bring that back. It is not going to be an overnight process. It's not going to be a quick and easy process. It's not going to be, oh, brilliant, in 12 months we're all best friends going out for dinner. That isn't going to happen. But it can end. What can happen is it can stop now, and then the rebuilding, the healing can begin. And the big listen that they discuss launching next week, the fact that there's now a new chief inspector, that they can all start to be part of a healing process. The fact that, you know, the DfE will be run by a new education secretary come the end of the year, that can all become part of a healing process between the horrendous division that has been stoked over the past, you know, few years. Started in the past, you know, well, it was already there, but it got stoked in the pandemic significantly by the disparity in the way that the early years was treated, and then it's just got worse and worse. And that has got, for me, I feel like this is the watershed moment where this has to end, and we have to decide, right, okay, enough's enough. This, you know, I personally don't see what's been achieved by either side silencing the other. I don't see any. I'm not seeing fantastic outcomes for the children. I'm not seeing more money. I'm not seeing, you know, families who've got more support. So that's not worked. So let's change approach then. Let's do something else, because we're not going to get more. This, you know, the 15 hours that are rolling out in April, that'd be a whole separate conversation. We started talking about funding rate, but ultimately there is not going to get more money for that funding if we decide that we don't care what the DfE think or say, and we're not going to let them step through the door.
It just seems like we're kind of really getting lost in all of this divisive nature, and forgetting about the child, forgetting about children and families, and that's not okay. So yeah, the refocus needs to be on what is really important. What's our goals here? What are our aims? Why are we doing the work that we're doing? You know, both the DfE and us as educators. Really going back to that. So yeah, I think this has been a great episode, and I think it's just so important to carry on these kinds of discussions. So for all our listeners and viewers, I'd say really do reflect, but also discuss and debate with each other, with other people, you know, even outside of the sector. Let us know your thoughts on this episode and the views that we've put across, and your views on Adam's article and the recent blog published by Ofsted as well. It's just so important to share all of the voices, and that's the main thing. You know, if we are sat here talking about this, we need to make sure that we are doing it as well. It's our responsibility to have our voices heard as well. It's not just about someone coming and saying, what do you think? So yeah, all of our listeners, you can find Adam's article in the episode description. There's a link. and also a form to fill in terms of sharing your voices and views with Ofsted, and that we will collate. And when we have more information, we can put more ideas forward of how exactly we can champion the voice of the early years profession, and how we can really advocate together. Of course, there's ways that we do this all the time, but in terms of actually making actionable changes, and actually really speaking to Ofsted and the DfE, I think it's important to do something a little bit different and not just kind of the same things over and over again. So yeah, do engage, do send in your thoughts, and watch this space for more information. Really, we're all kind of eager to find out what else Ofsted has to share about the big listen and everything else they've discussed. So yeah, thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for coming on and sharing your views, and for not just staying quiet, which is fantastic, because you are modeling that to everyone else.
No, thank you. It's been really, really interesting topic. Like I say, yeah, please do. Anyone, any listeners, any viewers, please do engage with the topic, with us. With us as well. Please come and challenge me with with what you think, and if you don't agree, or if you do agree, and let's see if we can really make that change now.
Yeah, definitely. Fantastic point to end on. Okay, thank you very much.